Yes, it's a great pleasure to introduce Gagan Shabran. Apologize for the pronunciation of it. I've been looking forward to this. Knowing Knut Ivar for a while, he's talked very warm and said a lot of positive things about you. And even though vision impairment might not be the thing we do the most at ours, I think some of the theoretical perspectives and views are highly relevant for this as well. And I'll leave the rest to you. Just go right ahead.
First things first, I should be very happy that Knut Ivar is building this bridge with University of Southeast Norway. I really appreciate the fact that you, as you just mentioned, Knut Ore, that vision impairment is not necessarily your forte, but you are able to still invite me and listen to the perspectives, and especially when it comes to ableism, that know no bounds, just as the way racism, sexism, homophobia, doesn't matter which country you come from, which nationality, what's the level of development, economic, social, cultural you have, you can still have those problems. So ableism is kind of akin to that. So yeah, I will just jump straight into this topic about ableism i Landet vi Elsker.
Nice.
So this is a little bit of and there's the most important thing of that title is Spørsmålstegn, question mark at the end, because I think that this has to be checked out, if you know what I mean. So let's see, if we talk about ableism i Landet vi Elsker, ableism in the land we love. That's the title of the presentation. So moving on, like just a quick sum up about my biography and work experience. I'm 34 years old. I was born and brought up in India. I've been living and working in India, United States, Norway, and I've also spent a considerable amount of time in Mexico and Spain before. And I have worked as a guest lecture tutor at Elsker. Prior to that, I have worked as a management consultant, and right now I'm doing a PhD fellowship. I'm in the last phase of my research, wherein I'm comparing disability policies and employment experiences of young adults with visual impairments between Oslo and Delhi, and I'm trying to search or illuminate or highlight points of convergence and similarities across these different structural, economic, institutional contexts. That was my biography. Moving on, the idea, here's a research outcome so that you have a little bit of an idea about what kind of things I have been writing about or researching about in the past 5 years. So the first article which I wrote and published, it's called as Two Worlds, Two Apart, Two Converge. And what I mean by that is what I'm exploring in that particular article is the idea that how these two countries, Norway and India, are two worlds apart. One belongs to the global north, rich, developed, advanced economy, and the other belonging to the global south, developing, industrialized economy. And in spite of there being social, economic, cultural, political, demographic differences, these countries have followed a similar policy trajectory when it comes to anti-discrimination norms, equality principles, universal design regulations in the past 3 decades. That's the first research article. The second research article is Two Factors, One Direction Towards Social Regulation Policy Convergence. In that, I'm trying to explicate why on earth are these two countries going in the direction towards this anti-discrimination norms or equality principles, and what's triggering this convergence. In the third article, I move from the macro level to the micro level. I talk about the barrier perceptions of young adults with vision impairments. It's titled Turning a Blind Eye to Employers' Discrimination, Spørsmålstegn, question mark at the end. And again, the idea is to hear from the vision impaired youth from Oslo and Delhi and to understand what are their perspectives with regards to employment situation. Is it easy for them to enter the labor market, and what are the attitudinal barriers they encounter? The fourth research article is the one concerning social resilience, in which I'm trying to explore the idea that what helps young adults with visual impairments in Oslo and Delhi to gain employment. What are the contributing factors at the individual level and the structural level, which protects these people from the risk of unemployment and nudges them to enter the labor market in Oslo and Delhi. And the last article, I'm talking about insider, outsider, and in-betweener. Pardon me. The idea is that here I am, vision impaired youth, quote unquote legally blind, using a screen reader, JAWS, job access with speech, white cane, 34 years old, living and working, was lived and worked in Oslo and Delhi, was been in and out of the labor market in Oslo and Delhi, and I'm trying to understand the employment and life experiences of these youth. There's a lot of overlap. So how do I see myself, and what kind of data collection, analysis, ethical challenges did I encounter? So I illuminate some of those things. Well, that's about the 5 research articles. Soon they will, most of them are in the final stages, and soon they'll be published, the last couple of them. So here we are. So I was talking about some moments ago about the situation of disabled people, and just at the macro level, it'll be nice to know some pointers. You know, there are approximately 1 billion people with disabilities, 15% of the world population, according to the last report on world disability. It's 470 to 480 million of them are of working age. A vast majority of these people live in the global south, almost 80 to 90%. A vast majority of these people who live in the global south who have a disability, they encounter poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes, social isolation, community marginalization, and employment exclusion. And it's the employment exclusion of people with disabilities which is my area of interest and my area of understanding, where I'm trying to explore what are the factors which leads to their employment exclusion, and how could we make it a little better for them at the macro level. And as I mentioned in that slide, the last point, trillions of dollars are being lost to the world GDP because of the fact that many people, or vast majority of working age people with impairments, are sitting outside the labor market and not participating as active members. Yeah, so that's the broad background at the macroscopic level, a bird's eye view of the situation of people with disabilities. Moving on, if we just check the idea about what's the situation in Norway, we the best, of course, number 1 on the Human Development Index, which measures life expectancy, educational outcomes, and health indicators, and aspects such as gender equality and social inclusion and cohesion. And if you look at the employment situation, it's kind of a bit shambolic, 42 to 45%. It has hovered around, as compared to in general population, the rate has been around 75% and more in the times of economic development and boom, when the oil prices were pretty high in 2012-13. Everybody kind of were able to find work, but when it comes to people with impairments, it was a bit difficult. Norway, unsurprisingly, spends 4.3% of its GDP on disability protection expenditure. This is a huge amount of money if you think about it. Like this expenditure involves expenditure on sickness benefits, insurance, and social services, Uføretrygd, and what have you. So there's a huge amount of money which is being spent. But when it comes to the employment situation, I would like you to take a note of what's the last bullet saying. Professor Jan Thosebro and Bjorn Winden saying that Norway is mediocre, quote unquote, compared to other developed, advanced, industrialized OECD countries as far as the employment inclusion is concerned for persons with disabilities. And there are lots of young people with impairments, many of them who have mental health issues, depression, social anxiety, who fail to chronic fatigue syndrome, who fail to participate in the labor market. So that's a huge cause of concern according to the Norwegian government. Ministry of Labor report, job strategy for persons with disabilities. It was published in 2011-2012. Moving on to the kind of barriers, as I mentioned some moments ago, I really like the question about employment situation. So, what are the barriers that people encounter? There are, of course, attitudinal barriers, ableism, discrimination, prejudice, which prevails in the labor market in particular and general society as well. When it comes to there are issues with regards to accessibility barriers. There are hardly good ramps for people who want to participate, go to restaurants, go out, participate in the labor market at the workplace, and so on. There are problems with structural barriers, wherein the question is that this labor market is becoming more competitive. There are productivity concerns, there are cost concerns, and efficiency concerns, and because of that, the employers say, I don't think that disabled people can participate because we expect labor market flexibilization. When alongside there are issues with regards to disability pensions, a rigidity in those systems which kind of inhibit some people to be who have impairments to be a bit more adventurous and say, I want to check out job opportunities, because perhaps if they do that, then they might stand a risk of either losing their pension or getting a pension at a reduced rate. So there are problems with that, and there have been some reforms which have been taking place in the recent years, the past 6 years, but those have not yet resulted in positive outcomes for young adults with disabilities in general. And then, of course, at the end, there are individual barriers. The health impairment of an individual can preclude him or her from participating in the labor market. If a person has a chronic situation and they cannot participate, then it is understandable as well. So not everybody who has an impairment needs to participate in the labor market to find meaning and purpose in life. One can do that with other issues as well. So here we are with regards to ableism, disableism, and
Disability definitions.
definitions. Great, thank you. So there are 5 ways in which you could define disability. There is a philanthropic understanding, the biomedical understanding, sociological, economic, and socio-political. And before I talk about all these 5, I should say it for the record that I gave a lecture from 10 to 11:30 this morning, titled The Evolution of Disabled People from Passive Users to Active Citizens, and I'm going to upload that lecture soon, perhaps tomorrow after editing a little bit. And I shall share some of those experiences with you, because this slide was part of that lecture as well. So as I mentioned in the slide, we have been experiencing disability for millennia. People with disabilities have been with us. Pick up the Bible and you shall hear phrases such as the lame shall walk and the blind shall see. In the same way, you go to the Hindu text, and you will listen to phrases about karma, how popular that is. As you sow, so shall you reap. These ideas. So this philanthropic definition is concerned primarily with the idea of charity, empathy, pity, and trying to make sure that conceptualized disabled people are as individuals who have disability as a result of their sins which have kind of moved on from the previous generation, or perhaps their families engaged in some sinful behavior, and God are smiting this person. And that's the understanding of philanthropic perspective on disability and impairment. We can move to biomedical, which has been existing since early 1800s. After the popularization of germ theory, the more we came to know about diseases, sickness, pathology, that's what we started thinking about disability. Then, okay, disability is more defect in a person's body, mind, their bodily functioning. So we know that people who work with rehabilitation, habilitation, and people who are concerned with social work and social services, they sometimes in the past have been leaning on this understanding of impairment. this understanding of impairment is kind of critical for the organization of welfare state, because welfare state requires there has to be a categorization when it comes to people with people in general. There has to be two major categories which welfare state generally relies on. One is the category of deserving, and the other is the category of undeserving. And disabled people are the ones who have visible impairments, visible disabilities. They are able to be intuitively understood as those who are deserving of welfare state services, benefits, programs. But when it comes to seeking these services, benefits, programs from NAV, from welfare state, we need to document the fact that we, quote unquote, disabled people are truly disabled, genuinely disabled enough. We need these services, we need these benefits to lead a fulfilling life. And for that, we often need letters from doctors and medical experts and health professionals to prove that point. So biomedical model is still alive and kicking, although we think or conceptualize disability in much broader senses, like sociological sense with regards to which is concerned with activity limitations. So Knut Ivar loves to go for hikes in Nordmarka, and if I'm sitting on a wheelchair, I might find it difficult to undertake that activity because there are no paths which are accessible enough. There are no trails which are made for people with impairments to go inside in the remote parts of Nordmarka. So here we are talking about activity limitation. So there you create a norm, Knut Ivar, nature-loving northwestern Norwegian, coming straight from Ålesund, enjoying Nordmarka. But Gagan sitting on the wheelchair, he cannot make it, so he is disabled, of course, and his well-being, of course, will be a lot poorer, isn't it? Because he cannot participate in the nature or natural gifts in Norway. Talking about the economic understanding of impairment or disability, we think about disabled people as being less productive, it requiring more costs, accommodation, building of ramps. I use a screen reader, job access with speech, and all these things make it expensive to recruit. So what the state does is you turn 18, you are blind or vision impaired, and you are from some small town in the south of Norway, let's call it Bamble, and the next thing you know, the state says, why do you need to go to Oslo to get education or employment? It would be very difficult because labor markets are tough terrains. So you better get the uføretrygd, 18 years of age. So that's one understanding of the way disability is conceptualized. A productive, well-functioning individual on one hand, and the dependent person who avails of welfare benefits, uføretrygd, disability pensions, on the other. And the last, the final, the most important, the socio-political understanding of disability, wherein disability is seen more as a group identity, a minority status, more akin to a race, like what Martin Luther King back in the day said when he was marching in Washington, D.C., that I want the United States to fulfill its promise that all men are created equal. So, and black, quote unquote, African American people were not treated equal at that time. And he mobilized the collective energy and ended up creating a society which is a little more socially just than what it was during the time of Jim Crow laws. So, wherein segregation was the norm. In the same vein, people with disabilities in the past 5 decades, from 60s, 70s, 80s onwards, have pushed the agenda, become more politically active, engaged, and have demanded that we want civil rights. We want to topple the social barriers the structural barriers associated with attitudinal problems and accessibility challenges. And the reason why these 5 definitions or 5 understandings, philanthropic, biomedical, sociological, economic and socio-political, are important is because how we understand disabled people and what are going to be our policy responses, programs, will be contingent on these understandings, this discourse. So for instance, if you meet a person on the street like me, walking with a white cane, and if in your heart the only thing which emerges is pity, sympathy, then you know what's the framework you are using. You're using perhaps a philanthropic understanding, the good old individual moralistic understanding of disability. If you see a person on a wheelchair, or with a tube, oxygen tube, and which she's using to breathe, and the only thing which emerges in your head is caring or curing the disability, then you know what perspective you are leaning more towards, going towards biomedical. So, and of course, if you join a march against ableism, march for equality, autonomy, inclusion, which ULOBA organizes. ULOBA is an organization based out of Drummond, or an Independence Living Festival, then you know which model you're leaning towards. You're leaning towards the socio-political. So it's very critical how you understand, conceptualize, and work with these definitions. The question about ableism now. So back to this important topic. All this was to just set the stage so that you people have an idea where I'm coming from when it comes to the idea of ableism. So at the broad level, as I mentioned some time ago, ableism is this idea of prejudice and discrimination against disabled people just because of the fact that they have a disability. This disability could be visible, invisible. Visible disabilities, we all know. Me walking on the street with my white cane is a visible disability. Anybody who's walking right next to me will say, oh, here is a blind person passing by. If you see a wheelchair, then here is a person on a wheelchair passing by. Invisible is perhaps the person has depression, internal injury in the brain, a person has issues concerning mental health, ADHD perhaps, chronic fatigue syndrome, Asperger's, autism. There could be many angles. So all these things could be reason for experiencing prejudice and discrimination. Of course, the second definition of ableism would be very interesting. I've highlighted some points out there. If you look at the idea concerning species typicality, able-bodied norms, wherein who is species typical? Are we creating society for this mythical person who in Norway would be white, male, heterosexual, upwardly mobile, middle class, well educated, productive, nature loving? Are we creating society for that in mind? Or are we creating society which is more inclusive, just, fair, wherein able-bodiedness is not necessarily a norm. So, and the third point is about disableism, wherein it consists of assumptions, and beliefs which can result into othering or marginalization or oppression of disabled people, and these might be unfounded, this might be implicit or explicit assumptions, but they operationalize themselves in the form of 3 things: affect, attitudes, behavior, and cognitions. So we all know how Hitler thought about persons with disabilities, thought about them as disgusting, parasitical vermin who have to be exterminated. And he did. More than 240,000 got killed under one regime. We should not pat ourselves on the back for the fact in Scandinavia there were programs in late 19th century early 20th century on euthanasia, wherein in Denmark they picked up these people with mental health, intellectual disabilities and said, off you go to that amazing island. We're going to euthanize, we're going to push you there. So the reason why I'm bringing that out is that disgust and pity are two very strong emotions which get evoked when you think about a person with disability. When you look at them, stare at them, the medical gaze through which we sometimes decipher disabled people. When it comes to behavior, like what do we do? Like, do we talk to disabled people? Do we have a dialogue with them? I'm walking on the street and you are seeing me walk, and you just run on the opposite side of the street because you don't want to be close to me? Perhaps. Do you do that? Or do you say, no, can I ask this person if he or she needs help? Can I engage with this person? What kind of behavior do I engage with? Is it about avoidance, looking the other way, turning a blind eye? Or is it about engagement, being dialogical? And then, of course, the final idea about cognition and the cognitive element, the thing is that when you assess disabled people as those who are weak, dependent, asexual, unemployable, inferior, then of course you would be saying, I would like to assist them, or I'm thinking it only, imagining disabled people as those who can or should or ought to receive assistance. This is very important, these three elements. So all these ideas could be broadly traced to two things. One is the cultural model of disability, which talked about linguistic critique. It emerged in 60s, 70s, 80s, which said that the stories we tell, the novels we write, the music videos we produce, the movies we show, the theater plays we enact in, determine how disability is perceived in the society. At the end of the day, we are storytelling creatures, right? I'm telling a story right now. I'm not seeing anything. I'm telling a story. Perhaps you feel it, perhaps you agree with it, perhaps you disagree with it, but at least you are listening. And that's the point. So the focus was that how we could transform this narrative, change the narrative, go towards more inclusion, more autonomy, more self-determination, more citizenship rights, and less of discrimination. And the last one is pretty important, like the idea of temporarily able-bodied individuals, tabbies. I think I've been trying my best to push that out into the Norwegian discourse, because this premium which we place on strength and how we vilify vulnerability, fragility, is a problem. I have mentioned in many of the opinion pieces which I wrote that disability is much more of a ubiquitous situation. We all know of people who are disabled somewhere close to us, be it our grandmother, grandfather, parents, some cousins, some friends. If we live long enough, we're going to for sure board the Disability Express or check into the what I call the hotel disability, like Hotel California. And we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to create society which appreciates that aspect, that the temporality or the temporariness of our able-bodiedness, if you will. Here we have, like as I mentioned some time ago, there are lots of chronic pieces which I wrote: Ableism in Landet, Elsker, Ableism in the land we love, Ableism in Blindgata, like Ableism of Blind Street, and so on. What is disableism, ableism, battling ableism along with racism? And I would invite you to read them, share them, and discuss them, because I think that time is right now that this issue of inclusion and equality, especially for people with impairments in general, needs to take front stage, because we're talking about inclusion for racial minorities and ethnic minorities. Now, how do we combat this ableism, disableism, funkophobia, whatever you want to call it? Yeah. So I propose perhaps two things which could help. One is the idea of social resilience. Social resilience is not resilience we all understand it at an intuitive level. When somebody says to me, Gagan, you seem to be a very resilient individual. Like you are having a positive, optimistic outlook towards life. You have a strong internal locus of control. You are this and that, and everything becomes individualized. And they forget that I don't exist in a vacuum. I am shaped by the institutions around me. My coping, adaptive capacities to cope with or adapt to risks is shaped by external situations, circumstances, the family in which I was raised, the school where I went to, the employment which I have, the country where I find myself working and living right now. All these shapes my perspectives and my capacity to be resilient. So I talk about Keck and Sack, the Paul Ruck's idea about coping, adaptive, transformative capacity. And I think the coping and adaptive is quite intuitive. We understand, we cope with the immediate risk and we adapt to the future risks. And when it comes to transformative, that's the thing which is a clincher, wherein we move from the individualized understanding of resilience to more collectivized, action-oriented understanding of resilience. We say, let us combine together our efforts. If I am working on the issue of discrimination, I could meet other people who are working on issue of discrimination from other impairment groups, or who are working on issue of discrimination when it comes to the theme of gender and race, and let's create a broad tent of collective organizing and push the agenda forward on rights and inclusion. That's transformative capacity. And when it comes to active citizenship, what we eventually would like to have is much more of a leaning towards active citizenship orientation. The welfare state, the government, especially in the case of Norway, Norwegian government can afford to provide financial benefits, organize social services, which other governments cannot. I know how the situation is in India. It's kind of rather shambolic. Norway spends 4.3% of its GDP on disability protection. If you think about it, it'll be close to 160 billion kroners. It's a lot. So we are, what I'm aiming towards is we start from redistribution, security, to recognition, autonomy, self-determination, and to finally reach towards influence, representation. So the Nancy Fraser's ideas of redistribution, recognition, and representation to achieve social justice map pretty well with the ideas linked to security, autonomy, influence. I need to have a security from violence, sexual and physical, from financial hardships in form of disability benefits, social assistance. At the same time, that should not be the end of the conversation. Often it becomes the end of the conversation for disabled people in Norway or ritual. We are taking care of you so well. Why are you creating so much fuss? We are giving you ufotryk. Why don't you just go back to the place where you were with your parents and live a happy life? Why are you thinking about employment equity? Why are you thinking about socio-political rights? Why are you thinking about the right about access to restaurants? You give me an ufotryk on which I could live, but if all the restaurants in my town have steps and I'm on a wheelchair, how do I access them? What do I do with that money? This is what Amartya Sen says is the conversion handicap. I cannot convert the resources which have been given to me at the same way in which Knut Tore, Bengt, Cecilia, or Knut Ivar will be able to do it. So we have to be very cognizant. Security cannot be the end. It has to be one of the milestones in the journey. We have to move from there to autonomy, wherein we allow disabled people to exercise their right of choice, self-determination. We have to get them from the institutions to the community. We cannot condemn them to the institutions. If disabled people are in need of user-controlled personal assistant, why is it in Norway, there are hot debates on that you cannot have so many hours, these are too many hours, we cannot afford it. How could that be a line of argument in a country which consists of 5.3 million people and sits on the largest sovereign debt fund which the world has ever seen? How? Similarly, when it comes to influence, in my assessment, this is of paramount importance. If we don't have people who represent, whom we can look up in our parliament, in our commune, in our bidel, who look like us, walk, talk, act like us, and understand intuitively our situation, there is a lot of undermining with regards to inclusion which can happen. For instance, let me give you an example. In late 60s, labor market was predominantly quite inflexible. Majority of the jobs were held by men, and there was this running notion in 50s and 60s that women should not be participating, or they can participate, but that's over and above, their pay grade, let's put it like that. And then women said, no, this is unfair. We need to have representation. We need to we need to participate. And here we are sitting in 2020, Anna Solberg is the Prime Minister. She's a woman. Perhaps this would have been unthinkable in other countries right now. So the question which I am raising is that there has to be very strong representation. Redistribution has to lead to recognition of the rights towards equality and autonomy, which has to end up with influence, political participation. So the concluding remarks, at the core of it, I want you to take three things away. Number one would be the idea of ableism and disableism, funkophobia, discrimination is an important social phenomena. It transcends the global north and global south divide. It's not so that Norway, everything is hunky-dory, things are just fine. No, it exists, these problems exist. Number two, we can find an alternative, an antidote to solving these problems by leaning on social resilience, fostering social resilience among disabled people, ensuring that they have coping, adaptive, transformative capacity so that they could participate, collaborate with each other, and they should be able to have active citizenship, wherein they could lean on three things, as I mentioned: security, autonomy, and influence. And we have to push the needle towards creating a society which is fair, just, equitable. Redistribution, recognition, representation. It's pretty important. And as I say in the end of this slide, it's about the public dialogue. We need to raise the consciousness of people. It cannot be seen only through the level of, yes, these are disabled people, we have taken care of them, we have given them what they want for living a meaningful life, and they should be just happy. No, perhaps disabled people ought to be a bit more conscious about their rights, push for their rights, and hopefully that will lead to a much more inclusive Norway. Thanks. And now we can just jump into questions, input, conclusions, discussions.
Thank you, Gagan. And like Knut Ivar promised, this was engaging, and you were engaged. I think I could see through the screen. Should we just open up for comments or questions? I'm not going to give a speech. I'll try to keep track of the participants?
I have the pleasure of meeting Gagan in many situations. We are discussing things from the Pope to the accessibility of in the streets of Torshov. Yeah, I'm really interested in this Norwegian paradox that you are lifting in the latest article as well. Can you say a little bit about what the participants that you met experienced, the similarities that was kind of surprising?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell about?
Yeah, like so for instance, in my research, I interviewed 29 young adults with vision impairments, 12 from Oslo and 17 from Delhi. And these people predominantly had finished their high school and 21 of them were employed part-time or full-time in contractual employments, and the remaining were seeking employment. So they are kind of what I would call them the snowflakes on the tip of the iceberg, you know, because often people with impairments, especially vision impairments, are not able to finish education or have employment. So these are very cream of the crop, let's put it like that, a bit of at the cost of being like urban. It's very urban centric research, and you could call it a little elitist because this is not representing the vast swaths of young people population. So when it comes to the issue of what I found, which was kind of similar, first thing with regards to discrimination is the question about misconceptions, negative attitudes. What is vision impairment? If you have vision impairment, can you use a computer? Can you use a cell phone? If you have a vision impairment, should I be talking loudly in your ear? Because you have a vision impairment? Because perhaps you have low cognitive capacity? These ideas were pretty strong, and these things were confronted during the time of the interview. In the case of Norwegian interviewees, it was really interesting because some of these people will go there to the youth participants will go to the interview, and there was always this question about disclosing or not disclosing. To disclose or not to disclose about your impairment, because if you disclose, perhaps the employer is like, let me just chuck out this person, this is not very relevant for me. But if you don't disclose and if you reach there and the employer finds out that you have a vision impairment, they're like, I think, you have a vision impairment, what's gonna happen? I think this is not the right place for you, we have to find someone else. And all this is going in their head, and then the thing which they lean on very, very conveniently is the qualification principle, which Norwegian law has. There is an employer prerogative, right, which says to the people in the labor market, employers, that state shall not say to the employers what is most relevant for you, who is the best person for you to recruit. You should recruit who is best and most qualified. So the employer will say, perhaps this person is not qualified, even though the person on paper comes up with the same qualification, with the similar kind of job experience, what the employers are searching for. There are lots of these spurious assumptions, ableist assumptions. There's a lot of misinformation and misconceptions concerning costs, for instance, and that's prevalent in Norway. What's happened in the Indian context? Of course, the Indian society, we all know, is a society which is based on primary hierarchies, right? We talk about caste system, which has survived for more than 3 millennia in India. So these things get also manifested in the form of these spurious assumptions, misconceptions, negative attitudes, what visual impairment entails, and what are the capacities and capabilities of people or young adults with vision impairments. These two things are pretty common. And what shocked me the most is that often there is this idea that the Norwegian society and the labor market is open, inclusive, accessible, and enlightened. And what I found is that perhaps it's not as open, inclusive, accessible, and enlightened. There's a lot of information work which needs to be done. to raise awareness,
Mm.
to increase consciousness.
Yeah, thank you for that short answer.
I give long-winded answers, man.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you have been doing is kind of really relevant for our field, and I was thinking about the bridges over to the mental health field.
Yeah.
Working with these issues, you present these models, and we are kind of deeply into this, trying to understand how to build more inclusive practices and how to mobilize civil engagement and stuff like that. So another question is, how do we do that? How do we work with political engagement?
I think when it comes to political engagement, the first thing is to start a dialogue. Start a dialogue from which is not just between, like, this Intellectual Sanatorium is fantastic, but there's a reason. I'm, by the way, recording this whole experience because I would want this to be a part of a broader discussion. Because as I mentioned to you people some moments ago that I recorded my previous guest lecture which I gave, and I shall share it with you, and the idea is to go beyond the contours of academia and university and so-called ivory tower, to go back to the street and engage with people. And the way you do that is, of course, by writing opinion pieces, participating in podcasts, engaging with people, like-minded people. And the point is this, that we should not hesitate from building bridges or trying to reach out. I mentioned this as a part of civil socio-political understanding of disability, that how the minority-based model or social barrier-oriented model, which started in 60s, 70s, 80s in the US, in the UK, required us to kind of say, okay, I think the attitudinal barrier or prejudice or discrimination is not only a major problem for a person with disability. Perhaps a similar problem does pervade across the line of race, across the line of gender, for people who are belonging to LGBTQ minority groups. So there we are talking about avenues of mutual learning, mutual engagement, and growth, of course, and collaborating together to engage. And as I think that the third point, redistribution, recognition, representation, and that we need representation at the local level and of course at the other political levels nationally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a question.
Yes. Yes.
Denmark.
Oh.
Denmark.
Wow.
Yeah, we have Leo that you mentioned earlier, so thank you for that. First of all, thank you for can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. I've really enjoyed it. And before going further, to go ahead and ask a question.
Yes.
Admittedly, I went away for a couple of minutes, had a phone call from Kinnigan, so I might have missed something.
Yeah.
My question is in regards to the outline of the different notions or ideas around disability that you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And a few of us have worked quite extensively with sort of similar distinctions or discourses around mental health, mental illness, addiction, these kinds of discussions that are very much similar.
Yeah.
However, to take those kinds of sort of debates around these sort of how these notions work at street level, I suppose I would like to hear more about, and this is why I'm sort of afraid that you might have said it already, but how do you see how these ideas sort of meet or converge at street level? Do you see how they are negotiated when they meet at street levels in institutions, among actors, etc., etc.? I would like to see, as opposed to, I would like to hear an answer about that goes beyond who actually represents the different ideas, as opposed to when these ideas are sort of when they meet in practice, and how do people make sense of these sort of at times converging ideas in practice? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a very interesting and important question because one thing which I have to mention is that there are different ways to conceptualize disability. As I mentioned, it could be from the moral philanthropic understanding, which evokes a sense of pity, to something which is biomedical, impairment centered, to sociological, social barrier oriented, socio-political, minority model, like pushing the frontier forward with rights and economic models. So you are spot on that different institutions have different logics to understand disability and impairment. For instance, like I get the example of NAV, wherein you go to NAV, and if you want to get like a user-controlled personal assistant, then you've got to explain to NAV that I really need this to be autonomous. I really need this for my regular day-to-day life, and these are my needs, and this is how it works. And then, of course, you need to back it up with a doctor's certificate or like a letter from the doctor saying, yeah, this person is not a quote-unquote fraud. Because with impairments and disability, there's always this question about fakery and fraud. Because the way you, and this is much more particularly relevant for people who have mental health problems, people who have invisible impairments. Because my impairment, okay, you look at me, I have nystagmus in the eye, I walk with a white cane, so it's pretty intuitive. Oh, Gagan is blind, or legally blind, or vision impaired, and then people intuitively grasp the difficulties. If you see a person on the wheelchair and she's standing outside a beautiful restaurant, niche restaurant in Oslo, which has stairs, you intuitively grasp her challenge or her predicament, right? So, but when it comes to invisible impairments, there's this question about, is there fakery going on? Is there a sense of fraud? The skepticism. Because we don't like the idea of helping, supporting, engaging with people who are quote-unquote undeserving in the welfare state, for instance, and this holds true for deserving poor, undeserving poor, and so on. So there's a long legacy of that. And what I wanted to say is that different institutions have different institutional logics to deal with impairments, to talk about disability, and they might coincide or intersect. For another example, which I think might be relevant, that there are patient-centric disability organizations which are primarily interested in taking care of or understanding disability through a medicalized health condition point of view, because they want better social services and social benefits. They are not necessarily interested in equality, anti-discrimination, and autonomy.
I guess that's another aspect of this that I'm wondering about, because one thing is that what Henry Moore was about in the logic of care, where she sort of disentangled the logics in institutions.
Yes.
But what I'm wondering about is, do you see among your informants that the users themselves sort of interchange the different logics about disability among themselves?
When it comes to at least the people who I was interviewing, the young adults with vision impairments, they were, as I mentioned, they were perhaps a bit more socially conscious about their rights. They were better educated, they were more resourceful, they were what Pierre Bourdieu will say had a better social, cultural, economic capital. They were based in Oslo and Delhi. And because of that, they knew that if they really needed to talk about disability or conceptualize disability, they had to externalize it. Predominantly, they had to say that disability is caused by social barriers or attitudinal barriers or ableist norms or accessibility barriers. And that reflexive, how should I call it, critical, self-aware, or like more individual orientation of impairment orientation or oriented understanding of disability was for lack of a better word, downplayed, if you get my point, because they perceived themselves to be more resourceful, more privileged perhaps. because they were educated and they were 21 of them had jobs. So, and they knew that's a privilege when they compare it to the rest of the vast majority of people with impairments. I don't know whether I answered your question correctly, but the point which I want to drive down is that different institutions have different logic with regards to impairments, and this can coexist and often push the agenda for inclusion in a much broader tent form. Yeah.
Before we went to break, I said I had a question.
Yes.
And I'll try to formulate this in a way that makes sense.
Sure.
First of all, do you know this term, which I don't have an English word for, arbeidslinja?
Yes, work approach.
Work approach.
Yes.
So there is an international term.
For sure.
Yes, thank you. I was amazed when I read your article, or I wasn't that amazed, but kind of surprised by all the similarities between India and Norway.
That's right.
Because even though I'm kind of getting used to all the disappointments, I would assume that the percentage of occupation, or whatever you call it, would be higher in Norway.
Oh, for sure.
And at least in relation to mental health problems, or what you would call invisible disabilities, I've kind of had this hypothesis that the work approach is just as much a hindrance or a barrier as a help or support, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on that, or
Yeah.
you do?
No, I think. Yeah. So you can ask the question. Yeah. Sure.
Well, no, that's kind of the question, because my impression, which is highly non-scientific, is that because everybody's supposed to work, it's easier to get the uføretrygd.
Yes.
Kind of.
Yes.
Because you can't do what everybody does.
Correct.
But that's just an hypothesis on my part. But do you have any perspectives or input? Yeah.
No, I think you're spot on. You're like hitting the nail on its head when it comes to work approach. 1992, 93, Norway comes up with a work approach, and I think in my second research article, of course, I don't explain it very deeply, but a part of this has to do with the trends coming from the United States, the vibration about civil rights, equality, anti-discrimination, and autonomy. So Norway in the late 80s ended up doing the institutionalization reforms, wherein they said people who were in the institutions could come back and live among live within the community. And once they came to the community, there was this strong push in the mid 1990s that we just don't want to come to the community, we want to participate in the labor market, which was in part facilitated by the European Disability Strategy, which happened in 1995, Americans with Disabilities Act, which happened in 1990, and the United Nations Standard Rules on full participation and equalization of opportunities, which happened in 1993. So this work approach was not happening in a vacuum. And of course, there were pressures with regards to, I should point out, with regards to the economy not doing that well. I guess Sweden had a huge financial crisis in the late 80s and early 90s. So more people were expected to work. You're spot on with that, and it was stated, I think the Constitution of Norway, section 110 states that, that everybody who has everybody who's able to work and willing to work should be given the opportunity to work. Or there should be as many people as possible into the labor market. So that was used as a justification to prop up the arbeidslinje, or work approach, or work line. And to your question with regards to the mental health, I kind of have heard about it and researched a little bit with regards to these two strands: place, train, and train, place. So for instance, previously the idea was that we will train the individual with who has mental health problems or issues with a mentor and then place him or her. And that kind of gave way to the IPS system, which was focused on, okay, let's first place them and then train them at the workplace. And it is working for some people. Some people are able to work with job coaches, job mentors, and all that, all the allied services. But at the same time, this normative idea with regards to you've got to work, wherein if you don't work, you are a less productive and more dependent individual. You are quote unquote a welfare scrounge. All those ideas needs to be problematized, and I think that's where active citizenship comes in. When they say security, this idea of security, it kind of gives you the option of opting out of the labor market. Labor market becomes more incidental and less of a decisive, essential prerogative, participation in the labor market. So in my head, work approach is good, but at the same time, it does not get reflected in the employment situation for people with disabilities. As I mentioned, their employment rate of people with disabilities in Norway has been around 42 to 45%, and the general employment rate has been in the upwards of 75% in the past 20 years. And that itself is suggestive. And the employment which these people with disabilities have is predominantly part-time, it's temporary, it's low paid, and so on and so forth. I could go on that. So in my assessment, work approach is a mixed bag. It can be, we shall see what will be the significance of it in the upcoming discourse on universal basic income.
Is that borgerlønn?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Do you know of any examples internationally where the work line has succeeded, or where there's a higher percentage?
I think Sweden is generally touted as one of the examples wherein the work align or this constant focus on internships and getting people into internships and then training them there and getting them into employment based on wage subsidies is considered to be really popular. But at the same time, the evidence is really mixed, and often the way Sweden determines what is employment and what Norway determines what's employment is a bit different. There are some definitional challenges, but Sweden is marginally doing better from whatever I have read. I would invite you to check out the work of Jan Tosebro and Molden. I could send some of the links later after the talk tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Victoria, I'd like to have more like a comment actually, Gaga.
Yes.
This is Sylvia.
Hi, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really engaging listening to you, Gaga. It's kind of a question. I'm just curious about in your presentation. Mm-hmm. You presented some of your kronikker og innlegg. Mm-hmm. And one of them was battling ableism along with racism.
Yes.
I was just curious because you have been talking about obvious and non-obvious. If you're being in a wheelchair, for example.
Yes.
It's quite obvious to see. And when we are talking about racism, we know that people, at least they feel that it's hard to get through and get to an interview to work because of your name, just because of your name.
Yeah.
And this summer, it has been, at least to me, it has been a bit sad actually when you're talking about racism, because we know that some things about racism is quite obvious, but when people share their stories about the feelings
mm-hmm.
of racism in Norway,
yeah.
it's quite sad reading, actually.
Yes.
So I was just curious about how you're thinking about battling ableism along with racism. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. I really appreciate that you brought that opinion piece up because like when I wrote about racism, I wrote about that piece. The context is pretty obvious. We are talking about the death of George Floyd, police brutality in Minneapolis, and the subsequent riots taking place across the United States. Right from San Francisco, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Seattle, right? And those notions came to Norway and the Western Europe, and this whole notion about how we often prejudge people, often have negative attitudes towards other people, primarily based on characteristics such as race, or in the broader sense, it will be also gender, impairment status, and so on. So when I talked about this battling ableism alongside racism, what I meant is that here we are standing at the cusp of real societal change. We are talking more about this issue of race relations in the United States and beyond. As you mentioned, there were stories about ethnic minority discrimination in the labor market, racial discrimination in the labor market. I would invite you to check out works from Mythbowen and Rockstad, who have been working on this issue. And when it comes to similar kind of discriminatory mechanisms are employed, the ones which are used to other the quote-unquote ethnic minorities, African Americans, in the case of United States, in the case of Norway, it could be perhaps Norwegian Somalians or Norwegian Pakistanis or Norwegian Asians. Okay, it's the similar kind of mechanism which is being used when it comes to othering people with impairments. Nobody on the street, or very few people on the street, would just see me walk on the street and trip me and say, haha, yay, look at this blind guy, I just tripped him on the street and he fell head over here. He fell down. Nobody will do that, or very few people might end up engaging in such outright violent discriminatory behavior or treating me unequally, right? But if you look at the evidence, I have lots of reports from France, from Belgium, from Norway, from Sweden, from Denmark, from United States, Canada, which says that employers, when they are thinking of recruiting people with disabilities, they take 2 steps back. They have prejudices. And they have this idea about that disabled people, oh, this is going to be a clear headache for me to recruit him or her. Oh, this disabled person might be really having less productivity. I don't want to hire them. Oh, this disabled person might lead to huge costs. So what I meant is that here we are talking about racism in broad daylight, which is taking place, and our consciousness is growing up, and we want to be more inclusive, we want to be more empathic, we want to be more equitable societies, right? We want to build that just and fair societies. So why aren't we talking about one of the biggest minority groups in Norway? 17.6% of people with impairments in Norway, which is almost 1 out of 5 person in Norway has an impairment. Why aren't we talking about the way in which they are looked down upon, the way in which they are being treated as childlike or asexual? I'll give you an interesting anecdote. There is from one of my participants from the study. This person is in late 30s or early 30s, and goes to Rema 1000 with the child, and low vision. She's low vision. And when she's waiting or searching for the food, there's this person who comes up and says, a person who's shopping, oh, do you need something? Can I do something? Can I? All that stuff, which people do out of pure goodwill or good-naturedness. And then she's like, no, I'm just fine, thank you. And then when she starts moving the stroller, the other person could not understand that she was a mother. So she said to me, the participant who was participating in the study, she said that this other lady in Ramatusen could not believe that I am a caregiver. I am not a care receiver. I have a child, I have a family. Because this other person stopped this youth participant and said, I'm just so happy, it's amazing that you're able to have like a kid, what is this? All of those things, So that's where ableism kicks in. That's where this able-bodied norms kick in, It's pretty implicit. It's often in a back burner in the back of our heads, which we have these implicit assumptions, biases, prejudices, and we have internalized these attitudes, which we don't even know of. So either this person should be a tragic victim, I mentioned this in some of the podcasts, or they should be an inspirational hero or heroine or whatever you want to call that, some person. And there has to be some kind of way to, quote unquote, normalize it, humanize the individual. There has to be a way in which we say disabled people are not just victims, dependent, care receiving inferior individuals, or exceptional Paralympics inspirational characters. There are the vast majority of them who are in the middle, who are like run-of-the-mill people. Why don't we talk about them in Norway? Shouldn't we talk more about them? That was my question, that was my point. Because if you look at the Norwegian statistic, 80% of Norway is ethnically homogeneous. Norwegians. 3 to 4% are people who are ethnic Norwegians who are born out of other parents, and then there are 10% who are from outside Norway. So when we could highlight the focus of the 10%, we should be able to at the same time highlight the focus of 20% or 17.6%. And that's where the collaboration, solidarity across races, across genders, sexual orientation, boundary lines comes in. So we need to have a much broader tent to discuss diversity, inclusion. Yeah. So that's the broad idea or the broad answer to your question about why battling ableism alongside racism. I don't think enough attention is given to ableism in Norway. I'm sorry to say. I don't think that's happening. So we need to do that more. Yeah.
Well, it's not a counter question, but do you have any ideas about why we don't discuss it more?
Yeah, I mentioned this in some of the articles. Like I think partly it has to do with the cultural ideas that if you like, as I mentioned, I've been working in different parts of the world, India, United States. I've lived in Mexico, Spain. So I literally have a little bit of cross-cultural understanding. In the case of Norwegian society, what I'm observing from an outsider point of view is that the tendency is to look the other way, to push the complex issues under the carpet. It's not so any uncomfortable topic does not might lead to, or discussing uncomfortable topic is not easy in the Norwegian context. I feel that because there is a lot of premium on quote unquote not standing out, quote unquote not causing a problem, quote unquote belonging to the center norm, and this is a major problem. Because one of the reasons one of the points I've been making in this opinion pieces and the podcasts and even my lectures is that let's start a dialogue. Let's talk about things. Because if you don't talk about things, if you don't engage with people who have impairments, if you just view these people as either amazing athletes who win 3 Olympic medals in Paralympic sports and represent Norway, and you say, wow, look at this lady, she was amazing, or if you look at them as, you know, this tragic story of a person who is literally begging to get user control personal assistant, then you don't get a good idea about the whole issues of concerning impairment or the attitudes surrounding it. So I think there's a cultural problem. That's the starter. So we need to have like a much more open, inclusive, enlightened dialogue concerning this issue. First thing is that. Second thing is, when it comes to, if you think about Norwegian words, you know, linguistically, say persons with reduced functioning, person med nedsatt nedsatt, right? And it kind of, again, obfuscates the problem. Why can't I be disabled and take ownership of my identity status of being disabled and feel a sense of pride? Why do I have to look at it in a very oblique way? Why is it that those people who have invisible impairments are so scared, so petrified, so unhappy to say, you know what, I have a disability? Why? Because there are these ideas. I mentioned this in the presentation. Perhaps a society, when it's being constructed, is being constructed for a mythical norm. And anybody who's not following or not coming close to the norm, the farther you are away from the norm, the lesser chance you have to live a more fulfilling, meaningful life. So in my assessment, there are of course cultural issues, there are linguistic issues with regards to how disability is being discussed, portrayed, and along with that, at a political level, we have a major challenge as well. I mentioned this in passing, that imagine this: there's a welfare state which is very generous, and the disability organizations which are being supported by the welfare state or the state. I go to Blindeforbundet and I pay a membership fee of 200 kroners, and the Norwegian government gives Blindeforbundet 2,000 kroners, for instance, hypothetically, for getting one member. So you cannot necessarily bite the hand which feeds you. You cannot be as critical as you would be in the case if you are an independent organization. So there are lots of these issues. So it depends upon how you want to understand it, what kind of analytical framework you are using or the lens you are using. But in my assessment, there is a cultural problem with regards to like when people are non-confrontational, polite, people want to be caring, and when they want to do these things, then they don't want to communicate. When they're scared of communication, then those prejudices become stronger and deeper, because there is no better antidote to solving a prejudice than to undertake information. Whatever prejudice you have, you only require one black swan to prove that black swans exist. So as I mentioned, those three things pop up in my head as of now, and then of course another analysis as well that you could do.
Hello, I'm Randy.
Hi, Randy.
Hello. Thank you very much for your thought. It's very important, and I'm concerned about the same topic as you, I think, in my PhD. And it's a big question why we don't disableism and not talk about the differences in Norway. But I think it's very important to talk about the otherness and not all this unconscious, good dwelling. Yes, and I think you have heard about Marianne Gullestad, the Norwegian anthropologist.
Yeah.
Yes, she's say that in Norway to be equal is to be same.
Yes.
And I think it's that typical. Also here in perhaps as the center, we talk everybody is different. So therefore, nobody is other. I think it's important to talk about the psychosocial disabilities, to be conscious about that, and to share collective experiences,
Yes.
and yes, and important to the politic from the bottom as well.
Yes.
So yes, and a lot of that, and we're not very clever to that in Norway, I think. So yes, there's a big lot of things we can do, but it's very difficult. So yeah, I'm not very clever to talk in this media, so very, very, very important. And thank you very much that you bring this topic in to us, our center. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Randy. I think I wanted to say this, but I'm so happy that you mentioned that equality is equal to sameness. You know, I would invite people to read works from Martha Minow as well, because you know, equality could be understood in different ways. As you said, Randy, very correctly, that in the Norwegian context, partially because of the historical legacy, that it's a small country in the northwestern periphery of Europe, it has relatively been isolated from the global, you know, upheavals and trends and all of that since for a vast majority of its history. It's kind of understandable that that kind of notion was created, because there are only 5.3 million right now. So to have a sense of sameness, and then you could have solidarity, that if we are same, we are in it together, let's make this country work. And janteloven, you know, you're neither better nor worse off than anybody, all of those things. So I think like those ideas are really problematic. And at an ontological level, disability or the experience of impairment challenges this very fundamentally. So let me explain this. For instance, if you say all people have an equal opportunity to education, okay? Equal opportunity to education, that's a law. So everybody has an equal opportunity to education. So if you decide equality in a narrow sense and say equality means everybody should be treated equally, then you are missing out on people with impairments, because students with impairments might need reasonable accommodation, might need perhaps a little more time. Students with psychosocial impairments, perhaps they have social anxiety, they cannot give class presentation, and if you are a professor who is organizing the classes and you have said, okay, if you don't present, then I'll reduce your credits, then the student who has psychosocial impairments or social anxiety is at a losing end. That's why impairment pushes us to acknowledge the difference, accommodate the difference in a way that the difference could be neutralized a bit. And so I would urge or invite you people to get, if you have the opportunity, to check Martha Minow's work on equality. It's fantastic. She leans on Aristotle and other older versions as well. So equality ought not to be treated as sameness. That's a very parochial, narrow-minded understanding of equality. It has to be a bit broader tent, so that we could appreciate differences and accommodate them to the best of our capacities to create equal access. Yeah. Thank you, Randy.
The topic about equality and our understanding of equality is really interesting, and I believe that the cultural problem arises when we have this understanding that kind of, even though we have this really good and robust, in many ways, welfare state, we have little progress when it comes to dialogue and understanding of these issues that arises here now, and that Gagan have been talking about. So I'm really curious about, I think one approach is obviously to engage in the debate, as Gagan has been doing, writing these pieces about ableism that also can bring and build a bridge onto the diversity of different types of unspoken disabilities in many ways. So, so this, how do we create this room for dialogue about these issues? We have been doing this at the center for many years in our field. So this is one way of doing it. We're meeting here now, we're talking about it, and maybe we are more engaged to talk about these problems at the dinner table and so on, and also engage in the political discourse and debate with even broader engagement, thanks to Gagan's work here and the work we all do and try. But I think it's really crucial to identify the barriers, and that's maybe we can sum up that in a last question for me. How do we, I asked about this earlier, the political engagement. We are talking about engaging more as democratic citizens. That we actually have the possibility to make some influence. But to get there, we need to work together.
Yes.
And we need to build these bridges between fields. So the question is, how do we concrete work now in the future to continue this work in a time where maybe it's even more difficult to talk about these topics all the time? We have a more polarized political situation.
Yeah. I think we need to give primacy to what I would call the Project Human. You know, the idea about human rights, which was just passed in 1948, right? That every individual who is a human being has a equal worth and equal dignity. That should be the point of departure for a lot of these conversations. And as I mentioned in the former part of this discussion, that it's so important to build bridges beyond interdisciplinary bounds, you know, and not just that, like to take these ideas, break it down, and bring it to the public's consciousness. And that's why I would like this word ableism to be popularized, to be used more actively in the Norwegian discourse, because we have this Norwegian word racism, which is a Norwegian word, which is a direct import from racism, right? We have a word sexism in Norway. How do we explain sexism? What's the Norwegian word for sexism in Norway?
Sexisme.
Sexism. So why can't we use the word ableism in the same connotation? That could be a very, very strong inroad, politically speaking, because there you have one word which captures a lot, which has a lot of connotations. It talks about the prejudices, it talks about discrimination, it talks about lack of human worth, it talks about mistreating people, it talks about able-bodied norms. And we all intuitively understand racism. If you say to someone, that is such a racist behavior in which you engaged on the dinner table towards the other friend, then the other person gets it instantly. But we don't have these kind of vocabulary to work with in the Norwegian context, because at the end, it's easier to divide and rule, right? If you have like a divided field, wherein somebody, some researchers, some academics, some people are predominantly engaged in only mental health, others who are predominantly engaged only with physical impairments, still others who are concerned about sensory impairments, still others who are talking about legal rights. And we don't engage with all those subgroups which are trying their best to create a much more inclusive, wholesome, just society. If we don't do that, then of course the needle will not move, or it'll move, but it'll move at such a small pace that its development will be hardly felt. So we've got to kind of rise up, be up and above the, for lack of better word, tribal interests, and see the broader picture and say, okay, how can we achieve more security, greater autonomy, and better influence for people with impairments? And when I mean people with impairments, I mean people who have visible impairments and with invisible impairments, especially those with invisible impairments, because in my assessment, those people stand a risk of being ignored, being overlooked, because their impairment is not visible, so they don't get the legitimacy instantaneously, and they might be accused of experiencing fakery or fraud and all the rest. Yeah.
Thank you.
No.
Hi, Gagan. I met you once at Oslo Met together with Knut Ivar.
Yes.
And I actually wanted to comment on something that Knut Ivar raised, because in this discussion about the inequalities, because SSB just recently announced this report showing that the differences in Norway are increasing.
Yes.
And that's due to the fact that they are suddenly, doing this statistically in a new way that they do not have been doing before. So I think that's really one issue, in the sense that I do understand the idea of dialogue, but at the same time, I think this could also be kind of naive, in the sense that, to me, this is a political question.
Sure.
And if you saw the leader of the Social Democrat Party yesterday, he said that would be one of the main things that the Arbeiderparti is going to speak of in the coming election, is the increase of this. And I think this is a very, very good opportunity to raise the issues and the discussions that you would like to have. I mean, in the sense, of course, people have to be mobilized through political parties and movements, the unions and so forth. But I think this is really an opportunity that we should welcome in that sense. And that means that, for instance, Knut Ivar's party, they have to have an analysis of what's going on in the world. Not only that we will bring honey to the table, but we also have to understand the worldwide capitalism, like the French economist
Picker.
Yeah, he has. I mean, he was here last year, and he was, debating with the at that time the owner of the Norwegian Air. And he, on TV, and he was saying, I only earn 400,000 Norwegian kroner per year. Look at me. And Piketty said, show me your, I'm not quite sure what's that called in English, but
Balance sheet?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Balance sheet, perhaps, profit and loss statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Er det noen som vet hva det heter på engelsk?
His fortune,
fortune,
paper,
Wealth paper,
wealth paper.
Yeah, okay. But of course, he didn't want to say that, because that's how you can see people are rich.
Yeah, sure.
Not what they have in an income. And I think, and he said that there shouldn't be any people that earn more than 5 million Norwegian kroner per year. And it's very interesting to say it's to try to discuss this. I heard the discussion this morning between the one of the government members and the leader of the the Arbeiderparti, and the government is, they are really trying to say that these differences are actually making people more happy, in the sense that you can choose which your life, how you want to develop it. This is really the idea of the capitalism. if you want to be rich, you do it. I mean, Trump, he is really one of the most clearest symbol of that way of thinking.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I think I agree with vast parts of what you said, Bengt, about inequalities and rising inequalities, and it's quite obvious if you go beyond Scandinavia or beyond the Western Europe or beyond the OECD countries to see it in manifest. For instance, in India, like if you go to Mumbai has one of the it's the largest slum in the world. It houses like 1 million or 2 million people, some God knows huge number of people in 1 square kilometer or 2 square kilometer area, and not too far from that slum in the same city lives one of the richest persons in the world, who has like a house which is 27 stories tall and with helipads, and which was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. So what I mean to say is that, of course, there is this stark inequalities which happens, and in the case of Norway, it could be hidden quite systematically through euphemistic explanations. And this inequality problem is quite perennial, and as you know, like capitalism thrives on inequality, right? In a way, winner takes it all. Jeff Bezos jumped into Amazon and he created Amazon, and now he's the richest person, right? And so in my assessment, those problems are quite real. Liberalism or neoliberalism, this comes back to my point about security and redistribution, Bengt. I think I mentioned about how in Norway we spend like 4.3% of our GDP on disability protection, and the idea is that, okay, we are taking care of our disabled people, or we are giving them social benefits and social services. Look at them and compare them to the rest of the world. They are on the top of the heap. Why should they be concerned? So this is what Schumpeter said back in 40s in the classic book Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. He said, like, at its very best, capitalism might create a well-functioning welfare state, So we are reaching to that point in the Norwegian context, that there is this well-functioning welfare state, but it's not. We've got to go transcend that. We've got to recognize, move from security, redistribution to recognition of rights, equality, autonomy, self-determination, and then representation. That's so very important. And coming back to your point, when I say dialogue, I don't necessarily mean dialogue between us. I think this is kind of pretty, as in your words, quote unquote, naive. I mean a much more transformative, capacity-oriented, social resilience-oriented dialogue, which takes different stakeholders, civil society, disability organizations, employers, trade unions, and to create a much more robust movement, a bottom-up swell. A classic example which I could cite right now is the example of Sparkesykkel. I'm walking on the streets and I've often banged into Sparkesykkel, and you might see me cussing and saying you whatever on the street, and this is a huge problem for me. This problem was taken up by Blindeforbundet, and in a way, people realize that the Sparkesykkel is not a problem only for blind people or people who are on wheelchair. It's a problem for pedestrians. It's a problem for vast majority of people who are walking on the streets. So Blindeforbundet had a huge campaign, and it was supported by people who were not blind, people who were not vision impaired, people who had nothing to do with Blindeforbundet. And that is the kind of movement which are dialogue building. You want to call it building bridges, having a broader tent, which we need to bring about social transformative change in Norway. Because I think Norway, in the Thomas Hobbesian sense, is a good Leviathan, the state. It's taking care of the people, but it's not enough. State ought to do more.
I totally agree with you, and I support the action from Blindeforbundet.
Yeah,
as a participant.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's what we need. That's what we need. Broader tent, much broader tent.
Absolutely.
Okay, it's getting closer to 2. Knut Ivar, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I just want to make to continue this discussion a little bit, because I think it's important, as Bengt is saying, and lifting this possibility that we have when it comes to this upcoming election that is closer. And we have 1 year until next autumn to kind of make the influence to the political parties that we are members or not in. So that's why I will take the argument of this dialogue as not naive, but important, because it makes this friction for me, for instance, to bring new knowledge into the political debate and into the kind of pinpoints that I want to say. This is things that we need to work with. This is things that we need to take serious, and the arising problem of social inequality is kind of in that mix that we need to take serious. And I think the analyst approach to capitalism is very it differs obviously from the political party that I'm a member of, the Green Party and the Red Party. But when it comes to sharing the goods and taxing, it's quite the same. And it's also a motivation for creating a society that is more just and fair for all people. And that means that we need to do something about this crazy capitalist system that still are creating ways to create inequality. And in that path, we have the opportunity to engage. And that's beautiful. I love it, to have the possibility to do so.
Just as a quick joinder, I am not a member of any political party. I'm pretty out of the fray. So I cannot comment on those issues which Knut Ivar was mentioning. But I agree with this idea about challenging social inequalities and checking who is at the bottom of the heap. And often when you check the people who are socially marginalized and who's at the bottom of the heap, you'll find our good friends, people with impairments.
You mentioned human rights.
Yes.
And this is a big topic, I guess. But one thing that's fascinated me throughout the years is that people obviously don't get what they have the right to get sometimes.
Yeah.
And what good are human rights if they're kind of reached?
Yeah. True.
Year after year. If you have the right to employment, but the employer has the right not to employ you, then what?
Correct.
Quick answer.
No, I think the problem of how human rights are such an ideal, and just a quick point, human rights are straight flowing from the Judeo-Christian ethic, so that's something which is a topic or discussion for some other future discussions. Coming back to this whole idea about how they are ideals and which are hard to operationalize, hard to practice, and if they get breached, yes, they get breached. But if we don't have a law, like for instance, imagine if there is no law which says that a person with severe disability, severe needs, impairments should have a user-controlled personal assistant. If there is no law, if there is no recognition, then the government can always shrug and look the other way. It's always, even if human rights are a blunt instrument. They are a very crucial instrument which undergirds human flourishing discussion, which undergirds discussion on human well-being. I would invite you people to check out like the works of Amartya Sen, Capability Approach, Capability Theory, Martha Nussbaum, the 10 capabilities, which she's talking about. And I think that those kind, and of course Nancy Fraser, redistribution, recognition, representation, because all of those are in part could be mapped back to the 1948 Charter. Of course, it's a blunt instrument. It's an instrument which leaves room for disappointment, dejection, anger, and frustration. But at the same time, if it did not have that, who knows how would the things be?
Randi, did you have your finger raised?
Yes, and I was a little bit afraid of if the question is too big to to do something with it. And also thank you to Knut Tore to mention human rights. And I think it has a lot of things to do, more concrete work to do to document discrimination. It is very difficult to decide if it one thing it's discrimination or not, especially on the psychosocial disabilities. There's so much. It's not easy to document and to have no language about that. So I think it's also important that we are also concrete and in our daily lives, see thing and document. So it is
Exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
But it's also important with the big questions, big grand theory and neoliberalism and stuff like that. I agree with that, but it is yes. So both perhaps. So yes, thank you.
Absolutely. I think discrimination of any kind is abhorrent and should be avoided. That kind of yeah, I agree.
Did you have a comment, Becht?
Yeah. I mean, within the mental health field, I think it's important to remember that the United Nations Special Rapporteur has made 3 reports. The latest came in June this year, stressing the idea of that when we are trying to develop the services and the understanding of mental health, we have to the basic has to be within the human rights. Sure. That's one thing, and the other thing is there was published a very interesting article. I think it was last autumn, where some German psychiatrist and the Finnish psychologist Jaakko Saikola and the special rapporteur tried to make this idea of human rights as concrete as possible, in the sense that they looked into the open dialogue treatment that has been working for like 25, almost 30 years in Finland. And then they concluded that the maybe not the best, but the kind of way of trying to collaborate with people who experience mental health could be through open dialogue, because it was reducing the stay in institutions, it was reducing the amount of medication, and they tried to bring in the network, and also trying to get people back to work or other activities. So I mean, there is a work, or at least that has started in how could these principles be framed or work within the mental health field.
Sure. If I may just add something to what Bengt said, and roping back to the idea of human rights and what Randy was pointing towards, UNCRPD was passed in 2006. Scholars such as Theresia Degner and Gerald Quinn have talked about the human rights model of disability, where they want to more concretize what do they mean by human rights and how that could be applied broadly to the disability studies field, and then the substrata of that, or like the sub groups of that, like be it mental health studies or physical impairments, sensory impairments, and what have you. So I think that there's quite substantial development which are taking place, and we need that as a much more concrete framework moving forward. Because when we talk about equality and when we talk about equal worth and dignity, these ideas, if we don't have a human rights framework, are really hard to argue for.
Thank you. I think we'll let that be the last comment.
Could I just say one thing?
Yes.
Okay.
No, but I mean, it's just an ending point of what Gagan was saying is that the fourth issue of the Norwegian Journal of Psykisk Helsearbeid is going to focusing on human rights and psykisk helsearbeid in a Norwegian context next year.
Yeah.
So you are heartily welcome to forward your different papers. And there would be some guest editors, namely Margaret Borg and myself.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, this has been interesting and at times overwhelming, but thank you, Gaga, for crossing this bridge to USN, University of Southeastern Norway. I think I got lots to think about, and maybe I'll see you sometime in the future along with Knut Ivar. We can continue this discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I really appreciate the fact that you people took out time on this beautiful Monday afternoon and listened to the perspectives which I had to share. And I liked your calm voice, Knut Tore, and this idea, or like the quote unquote word, overwhelming, because that's how things are. There's a lot happening here, and then there's a lot coming out here. So I know what you're talking about.
Thank you.